Ladies and gentlemen, the Rector mentioned the problematic issue of anti-Zionism and what is anti-Zionism, definition, and we have with us tonight, we are privileged to have with us tonight one of the best experts on these issues, the linkage between, or the link between anti-Semitism, the question about the linkage between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which is Professor Robert Wistrich. He is our keynote speaker this evening. Professor Wistrich is a renowned historian of modern Jewish history, and he is undoubtedly one of the leading historians of modern anti-Semitism. Professor Wistrich wrote almost on every aspect of what he called the longest hatred. This is the title of one of his books, Antisemitism, and he provided important theoretical framework to this field. Professor Wistrich is also one of the main first scholars already at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, who pointed on the linkage between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Professor Wistrich is the head of the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University. Please, Professor Wistrich.
First of all, thank you, Ronnie, for that introduction. And I feel honored to be here on this occasion, also to acknowledge the contribution of an old friend, Mike Whine, about whom I'll say a few things in a moment. I'm also very, very aware of the fact that this is a controversial subject. It's one in which considerable emotions, not to say passions, are often evoked. It's a topic about which one can hardly say there is a consensus. It's politically charged. It carries, for Jewish people in particular, a heavy baggage that I think all of us are aware of, even when sometimes some of us seek to escape it. In my remarks here tonight, I certainly don't want to be a panic monger. I don't want to suggest that Anglo-Jewry, which is part of my subject this evening, that Anglo-Jewry is on the edge of an abyss, that it is about to be swept away by some unstoppable tsunami of anti-Semitic hatred. I do think, however, there are and have been, particularly in the last decade, growing signs that there is real cause for anxiety. These signs or signals take many forms. One of them is illustrated by the very excellent reports, which are now an annual institution of the Community Security Trust. And I may say, as somebody who naturally uses and follows this material, that it's one of the most reliable sources of information that is around in any country, perhaps unique in its levels of reliability and care. In assessing, monitoring, and also analyzing the statistical data. And even if we were to confine ourselves solely to those reports in examining the situation of Anglo-Jews in the last decade or so, although these reports go back to 1984, we would see that in recent years we've seen anti-Semitic incidents, as they are very carefully designated in the reports of the CST, rising to new peaks. Obviously, there are particular years one could single out, some of them very closely connected with events that have happened here in Israel and the Middle East, particularly in 2006, then again in 2009, particularly in the month of January 2009, during the Gaza war, a staggering number of anti-Semitic incidents taking place in Great Britain. So while I do not want to encourage, by any means, any sense of hysteria, I have to say, when I think back to my own, both to my own experiences in Great Britain, I've now reached a point where I've spent an equal amount of time, about 30 years in Great Britain, where I grew up, and 30 years in Israel, and in between a few other countries. So I would say that in 1991, which is just over 20 years ago, when I wrote the book that Ronnie mentioned and coined the phrase, which I should have taken out a patent on, the longest hatred, because then I'd be a millionaire and I wouldn't have to come here and speak to you. But when I coined that phrase and wrote that book, I had one fairly short chapter on Great Britain, because that's what I felt it deserved in the broader perspective of global anti-Semitism. In 1991, if you were to compare Great Britain just to other European countries, I'm not talking about the Middle East, I'm not talking about places where obviously anti-Semitism was dangerous. It looked like a very comfortable, secure environment for Jews to live in, with relatively modest levels of prejudice towards Jews. And one would have to say, Anglo-Jewry, by any objective measure, would be considered one of the most stable, one of the best integrated, one of the most prosperous diaspora communities anywhere in the world, with strong institutional structures, good connections with government, and the British public as a whole seemingly fairly immune to the kind of vicious and virulent prejudices that characterized anti-Semitism in so many European countries. And that was a time where Russia and Eastern Europe looked to be on the point of implosion, anti-Semitism becoming a serious problem there, as it was in Austria and in a number of other countries. By the time I came to write A Lethal Obsession in 2010, which is a book about anti-Semitism from antiquity to the global jihad, but its main focus is nevertheless on the last 20, 30 years, I had to include 2 long chapters on Great Britain, and to look very carefully and seriously at trends which I think continue to be very disconcerting. Great Britain is no longer, in contrast perhaps to its football team, it's no longer in the lower levels of the European League of Anti-Semitism. It is a serious contender in some areas for even a gold medal. Now, these are very, I think, distinct areas. They don't describe the whole picture. If we look at classical measures of anti-Semitism, for instance, the kind of criteria that the ADL use, which I personally happen to think are somewhat out of date, when measuring classical anti-Semitism, Britain still comes low in comparison with countries like Spain or Hungary or Poland. Britain in recent years, on questions such as, do the Jews have too much power in the financial sphere? Are Jews more loyal to Israel than to their own country? Are Jews untrustworthy? All the familiar traditional stereotypes. Still, Britain is in a respectable position in the lower half of the table, ranging from 10 to 15% perhaps of what we might describe as real anti-Semites, compared with, let's say, Spain, Hungary, way over the 50% mark on these measures, and a lot of countries in the 20 to 30% range, like France, Germany, Italy, and so on. But I think these measures, as I said, are somewhat out of date. And part of the reason is because the new anti-Semitism, quote unquote, I don't unreservedly hold to that term, but let's use it for convenience. The new anti-Semitism, to the extent that it's focused on the state of Israel and hostility, vehement hostility to the very existence of Israel, to its legitimacy, on those measures, things look very different. And I would argue that Britain has become, in the last decade or so, one of the main centers for the ongoing efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel. And the public discourse that has become increasingly familiar and widespread in Great Britain when it comes to discussions of Israel, this discourse, particularly of the elites, and coming increasingly from the liberal and leftist elites, and from major quality newspapers like The Guardian, The Independent, but also journals like New Statesman, and from the BBC itself, even though it seems to me that it has moderated its tone somewhat in the last couple of years. On that measure, Britain is way up with a number of traditionally far more anti-Semitic cultures. When I say that, I'm not suggesting for one moment that Britain is an anti-Semitic nation. In its history, we see all strands in the modern era, including a significant level of philo-Semitism, without which probably we would never have had the Balfour Declaration, and whatever one may say about the British Mandate for Palestine, and there are many things one can say about it, particularly about its ignominious end. Nevertheless, one could make the case that Britain did more than almost any other nation in Europe to facilitate many of the aspirations of the Jewish people to a national home. So despite the dismal history of 1939 to 1948, and I could certainly go into that considerable length, but I won't, despite that fact, the overall record of Britain when it comes to Zionism and promoting Jewish national aspirations is not unreservedly bad. Of course, we owe a great deal to Ernest Bevin. I've often felt that we should put up a monument in Israel to Ernest Bevin, because he really succeeded in welding together the highly fractious and divided Yishuv of that time in a way that almost nobody else could have done it. When you tell the Holocaust survivors after 1945 that they should really know how to wait their place in the queue, when you send the Royal Navy to hunt down every potential Jewish immigrant to these shores in the years between 1945 and 1948, when you create those barbed wire concentration camps, or in Cyprus, when you send back Holocaust survivors to Hamburg in Germany, well, of course, you're likely to unite, as almost nothing else can, the resistance and the will to establish a Jewish state. So only in that sense, in that dialectical sense, would I put up a monument to Ernest Bevin. But Bevin has had his successors in different ways, different manifestations, particularly, I would say, since the First Lebanon War of 1982. And here a few words are necessary about the British left, or at least that section of the British left, because it's obviously not the whole of the British left, which has become quite extraordinarily, in some cases, vituperative, malicious, and malevolent, not to mention the many double standards when it comes to the discussion of Israel and its rights and the rights of the people of Israel. I was still living in London. Those were the last few months that I was living in London, in the summer of 1982. And some particular episodes stick in my mind. The best-selling children's author, Roald Dahl, writing about Mr. Begin and Mr. Sharon, whom, by the way, at that time I certainly did not support, writing about them as almost perfect imitations of Hitler and Goering. Presumably, Sharon was Goering. And remarking that never in the history of mankind had a people switched so fast from being the persecuted victims to becoming criminal perpetrators. This was at the time a very common statement in Britain. The future mayor of London in the years between 2000 and 2008, Mr. Ken Livingstone, known as Red Ken to some, who I'm glad to say failed in his bid very recently to once again be re-elected. Ken Livingstone, in that very year, 1982, was the co-editor of a newspaper called the Labour Herald. And there was a really notorious cartoon that appeared at that time in the summer of 1982, where we see Mr. Begin dressed in Nazi uniform with skull bones and Nazi insignia, and he's standing on a huge, massive graves in Lebanon, with blood dripping all around. And the caption below says, "Final solution." And Begin has this sneering grin. And behind him, there's a caption saying, "Who needs shalom when you have Reagan behind you?" And this was fairly typical kind of comment of the radical British left at that time. I actually went to a few demonstrations out of curiosity, of course, I mean, obviously nothing to learn, of the so-called Workers' Revolutionary Party, which was a Trotskyist organization that was led by the well-known celebrity actress Vanessa Redgrave. And there you had the slogan, which became more and more mainstream over the years in Britain, and it's not the preserve of the left anymore, but not of the radical left, that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians in Lebanon and more generally. In 1982, it seems to me that this perception became widespread. A few years later, I became involved along with a number of other people in a dispute which I'm sure Mike Whine remembers well, over a play that was produced at the Royal Court Theatre in London, very prestigious venue, a play called Perdition, which was written by a playwright called Jim Allen, who was of an Irish Catholic working class background, had a Trotskyist political view, and adopted the Kastner affair, well known, of course, here in Israel, as his particular stick with which to put Israel in the dock and beat it to death. And Jim Allen's claim, which was eagerly picked up by the radical left press at that time, his claim was that the existence which we've become so used to today, that these were the earlier days. His claim was that the whole moral and historical justification of the state of Israel is based on a myth, the myth of the Holocaust. And what was the myth of the Holocaust? From this, what I would call left-wing revisionist view, a historical revisionism from the left. Obviously, there's a historical revisionism from the right, which is Holocaust negation, which is Holocaust denial. This is a slightly different version of it. One which is based both on the notion that the Israelis have become the executioners, the Nazis, the fascists, the ethnic cleansers of today, and the Palestinians are the new Jews. The Palestinians are the Jews of the Middle East. This has become so banal, such a staple cliche, of all kinds of people, including well-known and famous artists in Europe, and I could go down a long list of the names of people who've indulged themselves in this kind of inversion. Whether it's the late Jose Saramago, whether it's Mikos Theodorakis, whether it's this Norwegian professor of peace studies, Johann Galtung, or Günter Grass in Germany, and any number of people who have their different versions. But these were early days. And in the mainstream, by and large, I wouldn't say that this had a great echo. And the British political elite, and to a degree this is still true today, and it's a very important thing that needs to be emphasized, that these trends, which I see as a kind of cultural pathology, that's widespread in Europe. Britain's not really different. It's not different from, in this respect, from Norway or France or Germany or but the trend is strong. It has not yet taken hold of the political elite. What we have are periodic sliding into statements that are usually picked up very quickly, both by the Anglo-Jewish community and sometimes by others, and condemned. We have politicians who make statements that I would consider anti-Semitic as well as anti-Zionist. And they make these statements, and usually they are condemned. One of the most recent, I'm sorry the ambassador's not here, but of course, I imagine many of you recall that he himself was attacked on the basis of how could an ambassador to Israel be appointed who was a Jew, because obviously he would have dual loyalties. The dual loyalty charge, which is one of the oldest staples of British anti-Semitism, as it is in other places, is not yet dead. and probably will never die as long as there is a question mark over Israel, and maybe even if there is no question mark, it will remain. It will remain because there is a certain level at which national consciousness still does not fully and completely accept the Jew, even in fairly liberal and fairly pluralistic and multicultural Britain, although the multiculturalism is looking shaky, as it is in other European countries these days. Even in that climate, and despite the integration of Anglo-Jewry, I believe, and that's my subjective judgment after many years of living in Britain, that there's a level at which the Jews of Britain, while highly respected, while admired on many levels, are not completely accepted as 100% Englishmen. As I say, there can be different views of that. Depends on one's personal experience. That was always my feeling. And it hasn't changed. And I don't think it will change. However, that is a perfectly containable sentiment. One can live with that. If that were to be the only problem which Anglo-Jews faced, then I think they would have no real cause for concern. But when we think about the boycott in particular, we see that this is an area in which Britain, I regret to say it, leads the world. I would give Britain the gold medal. And there are not that many gold medals, you know, that Britain is going to win in the 2012 Olympics. But I regret to say this is one of them. That when it comes to academic boycotts, the persistence in passing year after year resolutions, representative academic union in Britain. When it comes to trade union boycotts, Britain does lead the field. It is astonishing because I'm well aware of the fact that if you put it as a question democratically to the British people as a whole, they would not be in favor of a boycott. And if you ask the British government, they're very clear about this. They do not support a boycott. On the contrary, as I'm sure the ambassador will have said, I wasn't here when he spoke, but I'm sure that he did his job as an ambassador, and he spoke about the wonderful state of Anglo-Israeli relations and the phenomenal increase in the trade and commerce and the scientific and technological projects, and all of this is true. I don't contest it. The glass is half full. I'm talking about the half-empty glass. That's my job. What can I do? I have to talk about the darker side of all of this. And it's an occupational hazard. You know, I'll be very interested to see how Mike Whine deals with this because, you know, in many ways I think he's a model for anyone in his particular field to follow. And I'm sure that he's going to be balanced, probably more balanced than I am. But then we're coming from different perspectives. And how long have I got? I can go on. When I look at Britain today, what worries me beyond the things I have already mentioned? There are wider issues. I've never been one to believe that the study of anti-Semitism should be divorced from an awareness of the cultural, the social, the political changes in the wider environment, in every society. The fate of Jews in the diaspora, and in a different way in Israel, is affected by what goes on around you. We are all witnessing before our very eyes the unraveling of Europe. Now, I know that Britain wisely didn't join the euro, but Britain's economic problems are grave. They may not be, and they are not yet, and hopefully never will be, the problems of Greece, let alone of Spain, or of Ireland, or of Portugal, or maybe Italy. Although there are no guarantees. But history has demonstrated that in such periods of economic crisis and possibly collapse of a currency, of the banking system, of trust in the whole fabric of society, these are always dangerous times for Jews. That's one aspect. Another aspect is that never before, certainly in our living memory, has the fate of Jews in diaspora communities, including that of Britain, been so tied up with what happens here. And the Jewish community of Great Britain is very connected to Israel. And in their own distorted way, you know, the anti-Semites understand that. Of course, they get it wrong, but they do understand that. And those who are not anti-Semites also understand it, although in a more, perhaps, balanced way. And therefore, with the Middle East, as we've seen it, basically imploding from within, even though we've remained this almost mysteriously, providentially, this stable island within, I mean, that's how it looks, maybe deceptive. But all around us, revolutions, chaos, upheaval, brutal massacres going on in Syria and elsewhere, and the end is not clear, and how it will affect us. And another Middle East war, if, Chas v'Chalila, it happens, again will have immediate impact on all diaspora communities, and also in Britain. And this is my last point, inevitably, we are now here in Israel, as well as in Britain and all across the European continent, we're now more than ever aware of the tinderbox of immigration and its possible consequences. Now, Britain has close to 3 million Muslims. It also has other immigrants, some of them from Eastern Europe, considerable immigration. This is changing the fabric of English and British society and culture. It also carries with it dangerous potential. And let no one think that the growing hostility to Muslims, which is a fact of life now, in Britain as it is everywhere else, where there's a large wave of Muslim immigration in Europe, that this will make life easier for the Jews. It won't. It may create, in some pockets, some greater understanding of Israel's problems, but that's a minor plus. And this has already brought levels of radicalized anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories to the British mainland, which seemed like they were on the point of dying out, and they've revived. And I think the figures and the statistics show that British Muslims, even though they are by and large not Arab Muslims, but from the Indian subcontinent, that they have anti-Semitic attitudes far more prevalent in their midst than among the mainstream British population. And this too, along with their hostility to Israel, has become a factor. It's become a factor that may, in fact, grow. So, let me conclude by saying there has been a considerable deterioration in the general climate of discourse with regard to Israel and the Jews in Britain in recent years. I haven't gone into phenomena like Carol Churchill's play, Seven Jewish Children, a particularly disgusting example of it, nor have I talked about the Finkler question, so skillfully described by Howard Jacobson, but he is one among a number who have pointed to the increasingly toxic atmosphere that surrounds some of the current discussion of the Jewish question, quote unquote, which is not a very English formulation. So I think that Anglo Jewry is going to need a firm and a steady hand in the coming years, a level of leadership that perhaps it has not had to produce until now to face down the kind of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish bigotry which is becoming more common. Hopefully, this community, which in many ways I admire, will be able to face this down, but it will only be able to do so if it is very, very resolute in the defense of its rights. And in that cause, I think that Mike Whine has provided us with an outstanding model to be emulated. Thank you.